Hi there BookTube, and welcome to another video. This is still in my period of not publishing reviews but still recording them because of having recused myself, having been nominated for the Not the Booker Prize. So today I want to talk about Tokyo Cancelled by Rana Dasgupta, who was an author I discovered this year when I read Solo by him, which I gave 4.5 stars to and was very, very good, and I was quite keen to read what else he'd written. So this is the second book. This is actually his debut, Tokyo Cancelled. And as much as I enjoyed Solo, I really didn't enjoy this, which I'm not sure is Dasgupta's fault, because it's well written. It's just pushes a lot of my literary buttons that sort of frustrate me, which I'll go into. So the plot of the story, such as it is that an aircraft has had to be grounded at an unnamed airport because it was heading to Tokyo, but there are these massive snowstorms, which mean it can't land at Tokyo. And the city it's landed in is having a global governmental conference like a G7 or something like that. And that has aroused a load of protests. So there's very, very few hotel rooms because they've all been taken up by one or other of the sides involved in the conference or protesting the conference. But they managed to find places for most of the 350 passengers, and there are just 13 left. And they have to basically bed down in that sort of strange, fluorescent atmosphere that is an airport, with the strange fluorescent lighting. And a Japanese man suggests that they tell stories to each other to make the delay sort of pass a bit more pleasantly. And after some initial protests about, oh, I don't know any, or I can't tell them, you get these 13 tales, which are very much like modern day fairy stories. So there's lots of stories where sort of parents give children away and they become foundlings raised by other people, completely unknown to the parents. You get a story called The Changeling, which is what I'm actually going to talk about in depth to sort of display, to exemplar why this book so frustrated me. There's magical realism, and the themes are, it's a strange mixture of the sort of traditional storytelling method of fairy tales, but with very modern themes of commerce, globalization. One of the major ideas is memories, not only as memories but as data, and how they can be mined and commercialised and sold, which affects two of the stories. One of the things that frustrated me is I didn't, although these stories are set all over the world, they all had this, they didn't quite reflect the countries they were from in their telling style. They were just the sort of generic Western, grim style fairy tale, and you didn't really learn anything about the speakers at all. In between each story is probably a 1-page or 2-page generalised sort of description of them in the airport lounge. But none of them have names. Although they tell a story that might be set in Silesia in Poland, are they Polish? We don't know. We don't know anything about the tellers, and we're not revealed anything about the tellers through the story they've chosen to tell, which is really odd. Again, I don't know if that's a point about sort of the blending of brought about by globalisation, but I found it quite unsatisfactory, because what this became, despite the 13th story trying to sort of pull it all together, was just 13 stories. It's almost a book of short stories, and I couldn't really see the point of it at all. As I say, it has magical realism, which is a real bête noire for me. It's a slightly different magical realism from what normally annoys me about it is that magical realism is used very often as a sort of deus ex machina to resolve some otherwise impossible to resolve situation. That's not the case here. Here, the logic or illogic, I should say, of fairy tales, and what really frustrated me was these stories just sort of pinged around from it sets it in one tone and then sort of veers off into another and then veers off into a third, and there's some magical realism. It's not resolving anything because it's going to veer off in several other different directions. Now on the one hand it keeps you on the hop, which is good. You can't get ahead of these stories, but on the other hand you just think, well, they've established this tone and then they've gone somewhere else completely and never returned to the tone of the first bit. You think, well, what's the point of the stuff that happened in that first bit? So I'm going to take you through the story called The Changeling to sort of illustrate exactly what I mean, why I found this frustrating. So it starts off introducing us to Bernard Dussolier. So it's set in Paris, this story. And Bernard Dussolier is a changeling. And the first part of the story is it establishes the myth or the folklore of the changeling as pertains, in this story. Changelings can't die, basically. That whenever their human host is threatened with death or something, the changeling will skip the body and find another host. It is possible for them to die if they basically don't they miss the warning signs and they're trapped in the body that then perishes. But basically they don't die, and therefore they arouse a lot of resentment. But most of them end up in very sort of high-powered people in high-powered jobs. And this Bernard, when he grows up, becomes a banker for Goldman and Sachs. So that's the first part of the story. So it's in that sort of mythological fairy tale world, set in modern day Paris. But then it goes, one day as he travelled to work on the crowded metro, he became fascinated by the female hand that was holding onto the bar in front of his nose, and whose owner he could not see. I will marry the person to whom that hand belongs, he thought to himself, and rushed after it when he left the train. So that kind of thing is absolutely fairy tale land updated, in that he just sees a hand holding onto the rail, can't see the face or any other aspect of the body, but something about that hand he falls instantly in love with, his princess or whatever, and he will have it. That kind of stuff drives me balmy, because it's so whimsical. It's just, I can draw nothing from that. No value, no insight, no pleasure. I'm afraid I can't suspend my belief into sort of finding that warm and cuddly. And he does. So he marries this woman. But then, as part of his, pledging of his troth and stuff, he doesn't tell her that he's a changeling. And he gets discovered because he's talking to another changeling who's warning him about events in Paris. And what he doesn't realise is his wife has had to return home early and has heard him. She's outside the front door listening to him on the phone, hearing him. And the reason she's had to return home early, because there's been a serious terrorist attack in Paris that's blocked off the whole area, so she's had to come back home. So she rounds on him, sort of saying, this is a form of unfaithfulness. And the way it's written is actually very good. When I married you, it was because I wanted you to be with me forever. She was struggling against her tears. At some point I will begin to grow old, and then I will die, and you will not understand any of it. Perhaps you will not even wait around that long. That is not what love means to me. I now know there is no possibility of us truly sharing our lives. I thought I had all of you, but it is only a tiny part. She marched to the front door and flung it open. Then we have 3 more lines, and then that's it. It's moved on. She's thrown Bernard out. Now, I think that's a really interesting idea, this thing about long-term relationship, that one of you will die and leave the other behind. And, I think that's a really interesting subject for study, and I've written about it, but it's something I will endlessly read about to see other people's takes on it. So it's there, and then it's abandoned. It's dropped because it's moved on, so Bernard's out on the street, wondering, thinking about his situation, and it moves on to the next thing. And again, I found that really frustrating, so I had a really beautiful nugget there, which to me would set up an interesting inquiry, either to immediately follow or throughout the rest of the story. But it isn't. It's dropped. So Bernard is on the street, and he sees this guy that's sort of down and out, in terrible trouble, goes over to help him, and it turns out that he has flowers growing out of his skin and is sort of suffocating him. And Bernard sort of, feels sorry for him and says, look, I'll come with me. I'll take you to a hotel so you're out of the rain. And, he gets this sort of cheap hotel, puts the guy in bed, takes his clothes off, puts the guy in bed. And, that's a very decent act. And that's fine. And they spend the night together. And the guy's telling him, I know I'm dying. I can't, whatever these flowers growing out of me are, I can't defeat it. Even when Bernard sort of trims it, trying to clear his passageways and stuff, he says it's not really making any difference. I know I'm dying, and it's a terrible thing to die without knowing what your purpose is. If I could just find out what the purpose of my life was, I could accept the fact that I'm going to die. And what would help, or what might actually solve the riddle of what my purpose is that I'm sure it will be contained in one single word. If anyone could find out what that word is, it may even be a new word. So Bernard declares to him, "I will find that word for you." Now, again, that's quite an interesting concept, interesting treatment of death and sort of human purpose. And it's very interesting to me that it's summed up in a single word, because what do you have on your gravestone? You basically have your name, a list of dates, and the names of your loved ones, and that's it. That's your life in 50, 60, 70 years summarised in effectively one word. I mean, it's more than one word, but it's it's a blandishment. It's just a list. It's meaningless, even if it's dearly missed by whatever. It's no set of achievements at all. So I found that really interesting. So they wake up the next morning, and Bernard declares that he's going to go on this search. But I just want to read you how this section starts. The storm had passed, and Paris basked under clear summer skies that smelled gloriously of clean roofs and damp earth. The day was so astonishing that people stopped in their tracks to admire it. The buildings were radiant, faces passed each other with an otherworldly clarity, and the trees sighed and sparkled. What happened to the Paris in terror about this massive bomb that the night before? Has that been forgotten? This is why I don't like fairy stories. I do not like the logic, because sometimes it will touch with the real world, and other times it will drop it like a hot potato, saying no, that's too nasty and messy. We can't get involved in that. Well, you have, because you set it up. And before I carry on with the Changeling, I just want to read this from the next story, which is called "The Bargain in the Dungeon." In a small town called Bytom in Upper Silesia, which is in Poland, where nearly all the collieries had stopped working and the people were poor, there lived a couple who conceived a child. The wife was happy, but the husband was furious. "What happened to all your... Did you start taking your pills?" And then, he's demanding her to have an abortion. And she goes, "Abortions are illegal, Victor, which you know as well as I, and I will never do a thing so flagrantly defies the will of the church. Except taking birth control pills, because you were taking them, or at least you told your husband you were taking them." I mean, again, it's sort of it's when real world intrudes, it messes up the logic and the world of the fairy tale. So trying to do fairy tales in the modern world, if you want to use it to illustrate things about the modern world, it messes up the fairy tale elements, because of there are certain things in the real world that are real, and don't smoothly fit into a fairy tale world. Anyway, so back to Bernard and his source of the word that's going to help his Moroccan friend Farid. So the first thing is that he's sort of listening to snatches of conversation. He looks at leaflets, he looks at lyrics on CDs, which is really quite a creative and imaginative way of trying to find the perfect word. But then he sees a newspaper that has the headline, "Top Sax banker is a changeling, flees leaving wife, friends incredulous." So that sort of brings him down to earth. But there's a lot in the story about this day after day after day search. But the problem he encounters is that after we've had this bomb blast, now we have a smallpox breaking out in modern Paris. And it starts off with a small outbreak, but obviously it begins to grow slowly. Paris is terrified, so that it's going to spread. So the citizens themselves either sort of lock themselves up, or the government starts sort of dividing the arrondissements up with fences to try and ensure there's no movement of people getting out of Paris and spreading it to the rest of France. And that makes his quest to find this word, to move freely, to find this word, obviously a lot harder. I can't decide. The smallpox thing, it seems to be very, very resonant of what Albert Camus' book The Plague was, which there was a metaphor for the German occupation of France. And it's clear, and it's has precise dimensions, and it's well rendered. I'm not quite sure what it's doing here, other than making his task of finding the word harder. So there's a lot about smallpox, which is not fairy tale-ish in its tone. It's sort of quite practical, the government's reaction, the people's reaction. There's riots or people attack other people, people are different to them because they, blaming them for smallpox. There's sort of conspiracy theories that the bomb, disturbed something dormant in the sewers and that's caused smallpox. So, all that's quite interesting, but it doesn't sit comfortably with the sort of magical realism of flowers growing out of Farid and him being a changeling and all of that sort of stuff. So there's quite a lot about that. And then he's sort of basically cut off, the separating of the arrondissement, because he's going further and further in his quest. And he's basically cut off from the hotel where Farid is. But he manages to talk to a soldier that says, well, how do you think the soldiers move about? There are secret sort of entrances and exits, and he shows him one. Then he meets a strange person who gives him a business card. Albert Canet, Vice President, brackets Sales, brackets France, Sin Time Inc. And this guy also shows him a secret passage through the fence so he can get back to the hotel, back to Farid. So on the back of the card it says, Sin Time, noun, an experience of time in which past and future moments exist simultaneously in the present. Sin Time Inc. Global Business Processes. So it's quantum time or whatever. Okay, fine. Is it magical realism or is it physics? I don't know. And then we go to the sort of the conclusion of the story. So he goes back to Farid, and Farid is no longer despairing. He's sort of almost radiant as he approaches death. And what he is doing, he says, "Sit me in the garden. All these flowers that are growing through me. The garden is the logical place." So he sits in the garden. He starts singing these songs about death, but they're very accepting of death and welcoming of death, and they're such sort of inspiring songs to a city that's under siege and threatened with death through smallpox that the neighbours come and listen, and they pass on the songs, and the songs sort of spread throughout like a virus, interestingly, since we're dealing with bacterial contagion. And that's basically a lot of the book, and Farid is going to die, and it talks a bit about his legacy of these songs, how they sort of live beyond him. And I'm not going to spoil the ending about his death because it does throw in another extra element. But that's it. That's the story. And you think, okay, so did it matter that that Bernard was a changeling? Well, it kind of does. Did all that stuff about his wife and the woman, his hand, he doesn't see the rest of him he's going to marry. Does that matter? Well, no, it's a set-up of him being thrown out onto the streets where he meets Farid. What's all the smallpox stuff? What's the terrorist attack about? What is all the stuff about, Paris's reaction? Which has nothing to do with a fairy tale, really. It just doesn't hold together. It just takes these sort of swoops of logic. Now, okay, fairy tales do not follow regular logic, and that's fine, but the problem I had with this was he makes a decision, he takes me somewhere with this sort of swooping logic, and I go, okay, well, I can buy this, but equally it could have gone in this way or that way, and I had that all the time, all these sort of illogical moves which you kind of have to accept because of the tone of the whole book. But at the same time I found myself, well, oh, I would have done it like this, or I was expecting that. So as I say, on the one hand, it's good that that you can't predict it, but it seems not rooted in anything, so that any other alternative seems equally valid. And you think, well, he's chosen this one, but it could have been just as much something else. And I found this whole book frustrating. I didn't learn anything about the characters who were telling the stories. They seemed completely unrooted from detached from the stories. The 13th story tries to put it all together a bit, and there are hints of that, which are okay, but were not strong enough to resolve the whole book for me. So, Solo I'd given 4.5 stars to. I would actually give this 2, except I do recognise it's well written, so I would give it 3, but for me, I really didn't enjoy it at all. So, there you have it. Till next time. Thanks.